2004 was 20 years ago. God, do I feel old. And there were a ton of great rock albums that came out in 2004. But what were the best rock albums of 2004? Let's find out. Hey everybody, it's Nick here with you. Welcome back to the channel. So we're well into 2024 and I've been taking a look back at some of the great rock albums that came out 10, 20, and 30 years ago. I already did my video on the best rock albums of 1994 and you can check that out here. But now it's time to move up a decade to 2004, a banner year for rock and roll that saw some of the best albums released of that era. But what are the best rock albums of 2004? Let's do this. And at number 10, we have the self-titled debut album from Franz Ferdinand.
I say, don't you know? You say you don't know. I say, take me out.
Franz Ferdinand hit the scene in 2004 with their distinct brand of Scottish dance rock, which put them on the map. And I have to admit, I wasn't a huge fan of Franz Ferdinand when this album came out, but my longtime friend Ryan was a huge fan of the band, and so I just naturally got exposed to them by hanging out with him. And since then, I've come to really love this record. You got tracks like The Dark of the Matinee, you got Michael, This Fire, and my personal Franz Ferdinand favorite, Cheating on You. Plus their biggest hit, Take Me Out, which is essentially sounds like two different songs kind of pasted together that mix together really well. Once it kicks in to that dancey riff, you can't help but move. I may prefer other Scottish rock bands like my boys Biffy, Clyro a little more, but Franz Ferdinand are a great Scottish rock band and this album really holds up 20 years later. And at number 9, we have The Vines and Winning Days.
I'm beginning to need all that I can have.
You know, I have to admit that I didn't really think much of the Vines when they released their first album, Highly Evolved, back in 2002. I thought it was kind of lazy garage indie rock that was becoming all the rage with all the other music fans out there, including a lot of my friends. And although I did really come to love that genre, eventually it wasn't really my thing back in the early 2000s. But 2 years later in 2004, the Vines released this album, Winning Days, their second album. And my buddy Ryan, like I said, we were college roommates at the time, he picked up this album on CD. And since we were always cruising around in his car during our university days, I became familiar with this record and I really came to love it. Like I said, I thought Craig Nichols and the Vines were a shitty indie rock band, but this album proved to be much more than that. You have breezy, sweet melodies, Beatlesque harmonies. I finally understood why they were the hype band that they were at the time. You have the title track, you have Sunchild, the eeriness of Autumn Shade 2, to the rock stuff on here as well, as songs like Ride, She's Got Something to Say to Me. It's still an album that pops up in my rotation from time to time.
Looking at the autumn shade.
I followed the Vines since then, and they've continued to put out high quality music that I really enjoy, especially the Autumn Shade quadrilogy of songs. They're just brilliant, and Winning Days is a great record. Coming in at number 8, we have Kings of Leon and Aha Shake Heartbreak.
18 balding stars.
I'm going to mention him again. Back in 2004, my buddy Ryan, when we were in college, he was really into this up-and-coming southern indie rock band who sounded like the Strokes with a drawl. And that band, of course, was Kings of Leon. Coming off the heels of their debut album, Youth and Young Manhood, they kept going with their off-kilter brand of indie rock, but added more memorable melodies into the mix. I love the songs like King of the Rodeo, Taper Jean Girl, Pistol of Fire, The Bucket, Four Kicks. It's not as mainstream as modern-day Kings of Leon, but it's getting there. A lot of people think the best Kings of Leon albums are those early albums, and I do like the later, more modern Kings of Leon stuff, but I'm inclined to agree. The band had more heart and more of a unique sound back in 2004, which they quickly traded in favor of a more mainstream commercial sound, but at least we have those first two albums. And 20 years later, we got their new album, which has kind of more throwbacks in the sound to Aha, Shake Heartbreak, and the sound on it. Everything comes full circle for Kings of Leon. Coming in at number 7 on my top 10 rock albums of 2004, we have Keane and Hopes and Fears.
Everybody's changing and I don't feel the same.
Similar to now, back in 2004, I was all over the up-and-coming bands coming out of the UK. As a massive British rock fan, I was always on the lookout, and still am, for great British rock bands. And although Keane weren't necessarily like rock, I loved Hopes and Fears when it came out. In hindsight, the album is a little soft for my taste. I probably wouldn't break out this one as much these days, but at the time, it spoke to my 20-year-old emo heart with its heartbreaking vocals and melodies. Everybody's changing. Somewhere only we know this is the last time. We might as well be straight Strangers. It has some really strong tracks on there that I think hold up pretty well 20 years later. And Tom Chaplin has one of the smoothest, sweetest voices in all of UK rock, and he sounds great on this album. And at the time, they didn't even have a full band lineup or even guitars. They were drums, keys, and vocals at their core on this record. But good songwriting is good songwriting, and Keane had that in spades on Hopes and Fears. Coming in at number 6, we have Biffy Clyro and Infinity Land.
We are like lightning surrounded. You are the human strobe.
I have to admit, as big of a Biffy fan as I am now, I wasn't really into them back in 2004. I knew them kind of in name only. I'm wondering, who is this guy, Biffy Clyro? And Infinity Land in particular would not be a record that I would have gotten into at the time. Sure, they became stadium rock gods a little bit later on, but on Infinity Land, that was the last of their trilogy of albums that leaned on prog rock, math rock, and hardcore, which were not my thing back in 2004. But after I got into the band on Only Revolutions and became obsessed with everything Biffy, I went back and listened to those older records and subsequently loved them. And then the album just pummels you with riffage and screams from Simon Neil. You got strung to your rib cage, fucking stay it. I love that line on there. My recovery injection, some kind of wizard, the madness of there's no such thing as a jaggy snake. It's a killer record. And Simon Neil recently recaptured some of that hardcore magic that he used to have on those early Biffy records with his side project with Biffy's touring guitarist Mike Venart called Empire State Bastard. It's good to hear Simon shredding his voice again, because he doesn't really do that too often with Biffy these days. So although I wouldn't have probably put Infinity Land on this list if it was actually 2004, it's 2024, damn it, and it's going on the damn list. And at number 5 on my top 10 best rock albums of 2004, we have the Manic Street Preachers and Lifeblood.
The love of Richard Nixon, dead without assassination.
When Lifeblood dropped in 2004, I was not in a good place with my Manic Street Preachers fandom. I got into them on the album This Is My Truth, Tell Me Yours, and subsequently devoured their back catalog, but the band lost me on the Know Your Enemy album back in 2001, so I was on a Manic's sabbatical when Lifeblood came out. And surprisingly enough, Lifeblood is an album that lost a lot of other Manic's fans when it brought me back into the fold, but something about that record grabbed me. The more electronic production, the songwriting, it was different for the Manics at the time, but I really dig it. Sure, it doesn't rock like a lot of their other albums, but it shows the band's musical diversity and their ability to try new things, even if it didn't really work out for them critically or commercially at the time. But it's got some great songs on here. 1985, The Love of Richard Nixon, Empty Souls. Then you have album tracks like I Live to Fall Asleep and Glasnost. These are among all great Manic's tracks. And the band recently released a deluxe anniversary edition of Lifeblood, so it looks like they're finally giving it its chance to shine. But they did what they did best on the next album, Send Away the Tigers. It had big anthemic rock songs with big choruses and guitars, and I love that side of them too. But Lifeblood will always be special to me because it was the record that got me back into the Manics, and I've been on board ever since. So thanks to Lifeblood for getting me back into one of my favorite bands. And at number 4, we have Incubus and A Crow Left of the Murder.
Come one, come all, into 1984.
Incubus had a tall order ahead of them after the release of their classic album Morning View in 2001, an album that was huge both critically and commercially. And instead of just doing Morning View Part 2, they decided to follow their artistic instincts and do something a little bit different. A Crow Left of the Murder is an album that has plenty of big hooks and plenty of big rock out moments, but it's a little bit more left of center, a little bit more left of the murder, if you will. It's not as poppy or mainstream as Morning View or even Make Yourself, but still, it features some of the best all-time great Incubus tracks. You have the title track, you have Agoraphobia, Talk Shows on Mute, Beware Criminal, Sick Sad Little World, Here in My Room, Southern Girl. It has some of their rockiest and most tender moments all in one. The only song I would say on this record that I'm not a huge fan of is the first single and the first track on the record, which is Megalomaniac, which was their ode to George W. Bush. Just like Green Day and their American Idiot album, which is also on this list, the subject matter sounds kind of dated 20 years later, and it's not really one of Incubus's strongest singles. But the rest of the album more than makes up for it, and it's one of my favorite records of 2004. I was obsessed with this record when it came out when I was in university, and I actually saw Incubus on the tour for that album here in Hamilton. Maybe it's just the memories that I attach to it, which is probably what I do to a lot of the records on this list, but it's one of my faves, and it had to be on my best rock albums of 2004. And at number 3, we have The Killers and Hot Fuss.
I got got soul, but I'm not a soldier.
I was in the middle of university back in 2004. If there was one band and one big record that just screams 2004 to me, it's the Killers' classic debut album, Hot Fuss. I didn't know I would love these synth-laden pop rock tunes of a band from Las Vegas, but that's how music goes. They don't give us what we want, they give us what we need. And this album was definitely needed in 2004 and became one of the biggest releases of the 2000s in general. It's hard to deny songs on here like Mr. Brightside, Somebody Told Me, Smile Like You Mean It, all these things that I've done. It's an album stacked with hits. And why the amazing track Glamorous Indie Rock and Roll isn't on every edition of the album is a crime of music and must be investigated thoroughly. When I think back to 2004, Hot Fuss always comes to mind, and in a good way, and it really does hold up 20 years later. Have I listened to a lot of the Killers albums after this record? No. But that's okay. And it was on the Hot Fuss tour that I saw the Killers for the first time at the Mod Club in Toronto. I think it was the summer of 2004. It was right around when this record came out, and they hadn't really become huge yet. Mr. Brightside, I think, was the single. Somebody told me it was the first single, but Mr. Brightside was kind of the one that broke the doors open for them. And so I saw them in this tiny-ass venue in Toronto, and it still holds up as one of the best gigs I've ever been to. And at number 2 on my top 10 best rock albums of 2004, we have Jimmy Eat World and Futures.
Say hello to good times, straight up for the fast crimes.
Jimmy Eat World hit the mainstream in 2001 with their 4th studio album, Bleed American, with huge songs like the title track and, of course, The Middle. And that was an album that I was really into in the latter days of my high school years, so I was eagerly anticipating their new record, Futures, when it dropped in the summer and fall of 2004. And right from the first kick-ass notes of the riff of that title track, I knew this was going to be a great record. I love that riff so much. And the rest of the record continues Jimmy Eat World's knack for writing amazingly catchy and propulsive rock songs. You have tracks like Just Tonight, Work, The World You Love, Pain, and then you have Softness on tracks like 23 and Drugs Are Me. And then you have the song Jen, which the band dropped from the album right before release, and it should have stayed on there because it's a great pop rock track. The Futures album carried me through my second year of university, and for that, I'm eternally grateful. Ah, the memories. And even though it's been 20 years since the record came out, it's still an album that I go back to a lot. It still sounds as fresh as the day it was released, and really Jimmy Eat World haven't lost any steam since. They still sound great 20 years later. And coming in at number 1 on my top 10 best rock albums of 2004, we have Green Day and American Idiot.
Wake me up when September ends.
You know, Green Day was kind of in a strange place musically and career-wise when American Idiot came out in 2004. They had experienced a lot of success back in the 1990s with, of course, with albums like Dookie and the subsequent albums Insomniac and Nimrod, but in the early 2000s, they were kind of treading water. I always considered Warning from 2000 to be a great record where the band kind of chilled things out a little bit and were tried doing a more of a rock-out version of Time of Your Life, but the record failed commercially and critically, leaving Green Day directionless. But they found that direction on American Idiot, and Billy Joe Armstrong found his new musical muse, politics. Obviously, the antics of President George W. Bush and all of his warmongering majorly pissed Green Day off, and that lit a fire under them musically. Not only is American Idiot stronger in its direction, its themes and lyrics, it's a strong album overall with some of Green Day's catchiest and biggest songs. You have the big singles, of course, like the title track, but then you have Boulevard of Broken Dreams with its Wonderwall chord progression, Wake Me Up When September Ends, and Holiday, which were all monster hits at the time and returned Green Day to rock radio god status. But then some of these album tracks, Jesus of Suburbia is one of the most epic multi-part songs ever. Give Me Novocaine, Extraordinary Girl, What's Her Name, St. Jimmy. It's a stacked track list from front to back. It's also the perfect mix of music and politics and message, which sometimes don't go together well. And it gave Green Day their musical mojo back, and they've been able to ride that wave ever since for the last 20 years. My only complaint is that some of the lyrics do sound dated now that George W. Bush hasn't been president for the last 20 years. But Green Day haven't lost their fire and their opinions. Their latest album, Saviors, feels kind of like a spiritual sequel to American Idiot, talking about Trump and TikTok and taxes and all the other things plaguing our society in 2024. We all hope things would be different and better by now, but of course, they're worse. And thankfully, we still have Green Day around to set everybody straight. And that is it, guys. That is my top 10 list of the best rock albums of 2004. Let me know what your favorite rock albums of that year are down in the comments below. I'm sure we're going to have some differing opinions. There's a lot of great albums that came out in 2004 that weren't on this list because necessarily they weren't really albums that impacted me when I was listening to them back in the day and haven't impacted me since. But let me know what your favorite are down in the comments below. If you'd like this video, toss me a thumbs up. I'd appreciate that. If you like this channel and what I'm doing here, make sure to smash that subscribe button so you don't miss out on future videos. And make sure to follow me on social media across platforms, Instagram and TikTok, X, and everywhere else at Nick Chino Music. And I'll see you guys again for another video here on the channel. Until then, rock on, everybody.